Hey guys, welcome back to Bryan's Mysteries and Adventures on Trail, and today we are going to be going to the great state of Alaska, and we're going to be talking about 3 different cases of either hikers and hunters together, or campers and hunters, people that went up to Alaska to go on some kind of experience, whether it was hiking or hunting or camping. And each one of these cases is sort of unique in its way. But before we get started, I just wanted to sort of talk about Alaska as its just size in comparison to, people that are, Americans or the rest of the United States or even Canada. But when you look at it, I remember I had a friend say to me once, like, oh, Alaska isn't that big. It's just like the size of Texas. And I was like, no, it's like half the size of the United States, more like it. But a lot of people are just not familiar with just how big it is and how vast. I mean, most of the places that are up there outside of Juneau and Anchorage, which are the 2 biggest cities, all these places that are isolated, you have to get to by float plane, helicopter, or, some kind of mountaineering trip into that area. Usually, if you're trying to get to a secluded, hideaway with a lake, they have those float planes and other ways of getting there. So just keep that in mind, because all these stories involve, float planes or other type of transportation getting people to point A and B. And because of this, a lot of people in Alaska in different areas up there become pilots or otherwise associated with these companies. So it's just important to know that, because all these stories kind of start out with them or one of these companies or come back to one. So I just wanted everyone to have a brief understanding of that before we got started. As you know, people that have grown up in a city environment. Now, this first story, these 2 brothers had grown up in Toronto, and they had always wanted to go up to Alaska. After they graduated from college, they went up to Alaska. When they first got up there, and these, by the way, these are viewer submitted stories, so some of the facts have been changed slightly. But so the one brother, after they got up to Alaska, he said to the other brother, well, this is a lot more vast and dense than I imagined, because they had gone to Colorado before, and he just kind of thought like, oh, it'll just look like a bigger scale of what we saw in Colorado. And honestly, as much as you might want to laugh at these 2 brothers, from what I've learned from native people in Alaska, or people that have lived there the majority of their lives, they say that most people that come there to either get a fresh start or to kind of go and live in the backcountry or even just visit have no idea what they're up against. They say that even people that have trained a lot to go up there, they're always usually overwhelmed with the scale of everything. And I think that's just something to keep in mind. So these 2 brothers, they hung out in Anchorage for a couple of days, and then they chartered one of these float plate companies to take them out to Koala Bay. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but I'll have a map up here to show you where they were chartered first. And they just hung out there. They went fishing. They just kind of did sightseeing. And then they had the charter plane fly them up to a little bit north of Anchorage. They came back, obviously, to Anchorage first, and they had that same float company plane take them up to this place about 100 miles north of Anchorage. And here they were told they were going to be staying on this lake with other campers and hikers possibly. But here's where the brothers' hunting adventure would begin. They were going to meet up with some other people that were in this same charter group, I guess. However, when they got there, though, there were other people in the area camping, and there was a few other people from this group. But the 2 other people that were supposed to go with them didn't show up. And the guy said, well, I can't go out with just you 2 alone. And so the brothers were like, man, okay, we'll just do our own thing, which this was their first big mistake, because they'd never been to this area, and they just blew off their tour guide, which was the only real working knowledge of the area. Worse yet, the 2 brothers actually decided to go out on this day hunting trip, and they thought, well, we're going to bring our gear because in case we want to camp. And they were just kind of walking blindly. From what they said, they really didn't have any knowledge of what direction they were going in. The one brother said they didn't even have a compass. And he said, looking back, yeah, it seems absolutely ridiculous, but they just wanted to do this, fun thing that they had built up into their minds. And so anyway, they're walking along, and the one brother, I guess, went ahead of the first brother, and it wasn't long before he heard him yelling something. He couldn't quite make it up, but he thought he was yelling bear. That's what he thought. And that's what actually had happened. His older brother, had run into a mother grizzly bear sow with cubs. and it started chasing him. And obviously there's no chance of any man outrunning a grizzly bear. And unfortunately, he also panicked, and he had dropped his firearm. His brother came across the corner to see his brother being attacked by this grizzly bear. He tried to shoot at it, but of course he couldn't hit it, but it was enough to scare the grizzly bear off. And thankfully his brother hadn't been hurt too badly at this point. And ironically, sadly for these two brothers, it was just one twist of faith in this story, because at that point, because of them getting away from this grizzly bear and just kind of going in every different direction, not to mention these are 21, 22-year-old young men. They were scared to death of going back the same direction they'd come from because they thought that's where the grizzly bear was. So at this point, they were completely lost. And the one brother said that they just looked around and everything looked the same. So now they're just basically wandering in whatever direction they thought was right. I mean, they said they tried to use the sun, but the first night came and they said that they were both just freezing because they hadn't brought the proper gear, really what they needed. I mean, maybe if they were down further where it was warmer, but again, it's no surprise that these brothers were now stuck, and they were sort of panicking because they had no idea how they were going to alert anybody to their presence. They didn't have a radio or a cell phone or a sat phone or anything that they could use. And so the next morning they got up and they were just trying to retrace their steps, and unfortunately they just ended up getting further and further off track. And the second night set in, and they were both just wondering if this was going to be it. Meanwhile, by this point, the float plate captain had returned to where he had dropped the boys off, and the others had said that they went off and they never came back. And this is when they knew they had a problem. So this guy was actually the owner of this company, and he set two of his float planes out to look for him, as well as a helicopter. And they based it on where they last dropped the brothers off. And this guy had grown up in Alaska. He owned this company. He was just very knowledgeable about the area. And so he went out looking for him himself with a couple of his buddies, and they used the planes to help them search for these two boys in the Alaskan backcountry. And it was on day number 3 that one of the men with the pilot spotted the boys over sort of near a water source, and he was able to get their attention. And if you're ever out in the wilderness and a plane goes over you, if they sort of dip their wing, that's a signal that they've seen you. So they did that, and they knew that they had been rescued, but it took them, according to them, it was another 8 hours before the helicopter could get to where they were, because there was no area for the float plane to land. But it did finally come back and rescue them and bring them back to headquarters. And just a miracle enough, despite all they had been through, neither of them had really any serious injuries, because the one brother had gotten over the ridge soon enough to scare off the grizzly bear before she really had a chance to do anything. He had a couple of cuts and scrapes, but nothing that you usually see from some of these grizzly bear attacks. So anyway, they said that they were so grateful, and obviously they learned a lot from this, and they were so grateful for all the people in Alaska. But they said, a warning, if you're going to go up to Alaska and you're not familiar with it and plan on going out on your own, you really need to know what you're doing and take the proper precautions. Our second story also takes place in Alaska, but it's kind of the polar opposite of this past story. This father and son had grown up in Alaska, or lived in Alaska for all their lives, and then they had moved away for whatever reason, but they had both lived in Alaska for over 20 years, and they were driving up together from Northern California and somewhere in Oregon. One of them picked the other one up, and they were driving up through Canada up to Alaska. It was something that they had always wanted to do, and that was part of their planned trip. And they finally got there, and they too were going to be meeting up with one of these float plane captains, and everything was going on without a hitch. They met up with their captain on the day they were supposed to depart, and they were going to do some sightseeing apparently the first day, and they were going to go back to camp, and then the second day they were going to go out, and they were supposed to go on a 1.5-day hunting trip together. And everything was going fine, and the pilot was maybe halfway to where their intended destination was, and something happened with the engine. This is, there's no really way to know what happened. According to them, this pilot had over a decade of experience, thousands of hours under his belt, and something happened and the plane ended up crashing. And unfortunately, the pilot died in that crash. However, the two brothers lived, and so they got out of the plane, but they really had no clue where they were. They had an idea, and they knew the general direction they had to go to, but they knew that the closest area they were going to find help was almost 100 miles away. They also knew that they were going to be passing through, all this grizzly bear country and black bear country, all the animals, and they were going to have to cross two pretty significant rivers that they knew about. And the father at this point was around 70 years old, so his son was worried about, if they were able to get to these rivers, what might have happened. They knew that their pilot was going to be staying with a friend that night, so they were worried that instead of waiting by the plane, it might be safer for them just to get started with their trek. It's going to take them maybe 4 or 5 days, depending on how trek they fare every day. And they said that they just decided that due to the condition of the plane and what they were up against, they just started to get going that day. They made it about 20 miles that first day through very dense terrain with animals all over the place. And they decided to camp next to this little lake and behind these mountains for shelter of the wind, because they really didn't have, they were able to get most of their gear out of the plane, but they didn't have everything. And thankfully, the guy that had flown them there, the guy's friend he was supposed to meet that night, he realized something was off because he knew his friend would have done, called him or alerted him through the radio, and he hadn't. So he started sending planes out. He had his own plane, and then two of his neighbors, or at least in his neighborhood, had planes. They sent them out looking, and they were looking for 2 days. And in those first 2 days, this father and son, they kept walking and climbing through all this rugged brush, and the planes found nothing. And they said that on the third day, they came upon the first river that they needed to cross, and it was great that they saw it, but then they saw around it, and it was just grizzly bears everywhere on both sides of the river, in the river. And the river itself didn't look too bad. They knew that they would be able to get through that, but they knew that they were going to have to go around this huge field or risk going through it. And when they looked off in the distance, there were bears all around it too. So they weren't sure how they were going to navigate it, but they knew that they had to go through this area or go all the way back. And they said it would have been like another 200 miles to traverse these mountains that were up ahead. So they just decided to wait until the bears sort of moved off a little bit, and they were able to cross safely, which is a miracle in these terms, because they said that there was at least 24 bears on both sides and in the water, and you never know how bears are going to react. By day number 4, they had made it down behind the second mountains, and there was a little pool there, a little lake, not big enough to support a seaplane, but they knew that they were headed on the right track. And at this point, they had only had snacks with them, and they were pretty much through all those. They said that their food bag had been destroyed in the plane crash, and also simultaneously why this was going on, but they didn't know it. The friend of the pilot that it was supposed to meet, he had sent out people on horseback, all his friends in the area that he knew that he could muster up. He got involved in this search because this is really deep backcountry, and they did have a few planes and a couple other people, and there was roughly a baker's dozen people out in the actual backcountry searching. And then he had his plane that he was flying over, and his second over neighbor, which he said in the report was over 3 miles away. So when they went out for the search, he went over to his neighbors and actually landed in his front yard to, ask if he could assist. And these guys that were out on the ground had actually been camping out overnight for 2 days during their search, because it was too much for them to go in one direction. So they decided that they were going to go in a circle sort of around where the plane crash they thought might have gone down. But again, a lot of this is just guesswork, because it's dark a lot more in Alaska depending on the season. And unfortunately, these guys, this father and son that they were looking for, they didn't have any type of radio or beacon. But that next morning, it was a lot clearer, and they could see up a little bit more, and they could see the winds howling over the mountains. And they were hoping that they were going to hear the planes. Well, unfortunately, they did start hearing the planes, but at that point, it had started snowing pretty heavily. Of course, they were waving whatever bright colored clothing that they could at the planes, and Mark thought he saw one of the planes dip its wing, but he couldn't be sure. Later the next day, going on day number 5, we got to a clearing. The snow wasn't falling anymore, but they decided to camp there, and they had gotten probably maybe 50 miles from where they originally intended to go, and they heard these footprints with a flashlight coming out of the woods, and they're like, hello, hello. And they're like, are you off the plane crash? And we're like, yeah, that's us. At this point, the man and the woman that we were trying to communicate with, they couldn't see us because we were so far back, and they could hear us, and they had stopped, and they were looking around, and we were trying to get their attention by waving our arms and trying to show them where we were so that we could at least all come to the same rendezvous point, because it was getting dark. And unfortunately, right towards as it started getting dark, we thought we were going to see them, but we didn't. And once it was pitch black, it was just, we tried with the yelling and to certain noises. We lit our camp stove as sort of a makeshift flare or lighting device, hopefully that they would see that, but no one saw us. And the next morning we just kind of like looked around the general area and then just kept moving because we felt like we couldn't stay there. And of course, crossing even more grizzly bears and more terror, but we managed to like pass them. And finally, at the end of that day, we heard voices, and we were like, at this point we thought maybe we were hallucinating, but because it had been so many days, we were wet, we were cold, and we saw this woman who was paddling in this little body of water, and she was yelling over to us, and she's like, do y'all need help? And we're like, oh yeah, do we need help? And so she paddled over, and she had luckily had a couple of friends with her, and they came over and they rescued us. And I never forget like how happy I was and the look on my father's face. And I also remember somewhat of a sadness, like leaving that blue majestic water that they paddled us across, and just knowing that we had survived this grand adventure and without any serious injury. And although it was scary and somewhat, obviously nerve-wracking at times, I knew it was probably the most grandest Alaskan adventure I'd ever experienced. So in any event, they rode us back for what seemed like a day and a half, and by the time we got back to their camp, it was snowing, and I just realized how much time had gone by and just how grateful I was for these people. And of course we immediately tried to tell them where the plane had gone down. We tried to give them specifics, but as far as I know, they never found the plane. I mean, they looked and looked, but just because the backcountry is so vast and there's so many areas, like things get overgrown, and who knows, but God bless that pilot for all he did. And honestly, there are these types of crashes all the time because these small planes, they have to go out in these high winds and then land low into a lake. I mean, it takes a lot of talent and skill. So my hat's off and props to all these pilots who risk their lives to try and give tourists, their excitement and whatnot. But it's definitely, it can be a very dangerous profession. And thanking you for saving our lives, because the way you landed, the way you were able to get the plane down, it saved me and my father's life. Obviously, you perished, and that's just a tragedy, but we just wanted to say thank you and hope you're resting in everlasting peace and the Alaskan beauty. I want to thank everybody for watching, as always, and please be respectful in the comments if you choose to leave them. Special thank you to co.ag for providing the background music, and I will see everybody in the next one. Take care. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me till the end. There was going to be an additional story to put on this video, but for some reason this phone is malfunctioning. But I'm going to make a few more of these videos, and I have a few more stories of Alaskan misadventures and also different types of adventures of people going up to Alaska and the Northern Territory. So if you guys have any suggestions, please let me know. Hope you're all doing well, and thank you again for all your support, and see you next time.